Our channel shares stories that actually happened. Do you know or have experienced any shocking stories? We also tell the stories of our subscribers. Leave them in the comments so we can share them with the world. We want to hear from you. They never imagined their lives would change so drastically because of one simple decision to adopt a child. Mark and Sarah had always dreamed of having a large family. After years of trying to conceive and facing the emotional and physical challenges that came with it, they decided that adoption was the way forward. They were ready to provide a loving home for a child who needed it. After months of paperwork, meetings, and interviews with social workers, they were matched with Matthew, a 7-year-old boy who had spent most of his life in foster care and orphanages. His story was heartbreaking, but he was described as sweet, polite, and shy. Both Mark and Sarah were excited about the idea of expanding their family and giving Matthew the love and stability he so desperately needed. They pictured family dinners, trips to the park, and late-night conversations about school and friends. But when Matthew walked through the door of their home for the first time, things didn't go as they had expected. Their 8-year-old daughter, Olivia, who had been eagerly waiting to meet her new brother, froze in place. Her eyes widened in terror, and she immediately ran behind her mother, gripping her shirt tightly, as if trying to hide from him. Mark and Sarah were confused. They thought Olivia would be excited, eager to welcome Matthew into their family. But instead there was fear that they couldn't understand. Sarah bent down to Olivia's level, trying to reassure her, telling her that this was her new brother, that everything would be okay. But Olivia wouldn't let go of her mother's clothes. She wouldn't look at Matthew. Sarah thought it was simply a case of jealousy. Olivia had always been the center of attention, and now with a new child in the house she might be feeling displaced. Mark tried to comfort her, saying that it would take time for everyone to adjust, but deep down, something didn't feel right. As the days went by, Olivia's behavior only worsened. She started avoiding Matthew at all costs. If he entered a room, she would leave. During meals, she would refuse to sit next to him, even though there were empty seats at the table. When Sarah and Mark would leave them alone for a few moments, Olivia would start to cry and demand to be with them. Her fear was palpable, and no matter what they tried, she would not get any closer to her new brother. The tension between the two children grew and the atmosphere at home became increasingly strained. Mark and Sarah started to worry. Was it just jealousy? Or was there something deeper, something they hadn't yet figured out? The more they observed Olivia's behavior, the more questions they had. And as the days turned into weeks, they realized that whatever was happening, it wasn't normal. Something was wrong, but they couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. The tension in the house was growing unbearable, and Mark and Sarah were desperate for answers. They couldn't understand why Olivia was reacting this way, and their frustration was starting to affect their relationship with her. Despite their best efforts to assure her that everything would be okay, Olivia's fear only seemed to deepen. It was as if she was living in a constant state of terror, and nothing they did could ease her anxiety. Sarah started to feel like a failure as a mother. She kept thinking, "Why can't I make this better for her?" The guilt weighed heavily on her as she watched Olivia grow more withdrawn and fearful. There were nights when Olivia couldn't sleep at all, tossing and turning in her bed, crying out in her sleep, and waking up with tears streaming down her face. Sarah would sit by her bedside holding her hand, trying to comfort her, but Olivia wouldn't talk. She wouldn't say what was wrong. Sarah begged her, asking her over and over, "What's happening, Olivia? Why won't you tell me?" But Olivia would only shake her head, her face pale with fear, and she would close her eyes as if trying to block out the world around her. The family's once joyful and peaceful home was now filled with an overwhelming sense of unease. Mark was starting to worry that something might be seriously wrong with Olivia. He suggested they seek help from a therapist or counselor, but Sarah was reluctant. She didn't want to jump to conclusions or make things worse. She still held on to the hope that it was just a phase, a difficult adjustment period that would eventually pass. But then the strange occurrences began. At first, it was small things. Unexplained noises at night like the creak of the floorboards when no one was walking, or the faint sound of something scraping against the walls. The lights in the hallway would flicker, and sometimes they would turn on and off without reason, It was unsettling, but Sarah convinced herself it was just the house settling, or maybe faulty wiring. But then the strange events started to involve Matthew. There were moments when he would sit in the living room, staring at Olivia from across the room. His gaze was intense, unblinking, and his posture was unnerving, always still as if he was waiting for something. And when Olivia would look up and catch his eyes, her expression would change. It was as if she had seen a ghost, and the terror in her eyes was enough to make Mark and Sarah uneasy. They didn't know what to make of it. Matthew didn't speak much, but his silence seemed to weigh on the family like a thick fog. It wasn't just the way he looked at Olivia that unsettled them. It was the way he seemed to be everywhere, always just a little too close to her, always watching. And then came the day when Olivia's beloved toys started to go missing, only to be found later broken, damaged in ways that didn't make sense. Dolls with limbs snapped off, stuffed animals with their eyes torn out, things that could have only been destroyed with force. Mark and Sarah tried to brush it off, blaming it on Matthew's unfamiliarity with their home. But deep down, they couldn't ignore the strange pattern forming. It wasn't just the broken toys. There were other things, small, unsettling things. Doors that creaked open in the middle of the night when no one was there, a chair that would rock back and forth on its own, and the constant feeling of being watched. Mark and Sarah couldn't deny it any longer. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just Olivia's fear. There was something about Matthew that was causing all of this, and they had no idea what to do about it. One night, after Olivia had another restless night filled with nightmares, Sarah reached her breaking point. The tension in their home had become unbearable, and Sarah couldn't handle it any longer. She needed answers for herself, but more importantly, for Olivia. She sat on the edge of Olivia's bed, the moonlight filtering through the curtains and casting a pale glow on her daughter's face. Olivia was curled under her blanket, her body shaking as she fought the lingering fear that had become a constant companion. Sarah had tried everything to reassure her, but it was clear that nothing was working. Olivia wasn't just adjusting to a new sibling. Something else, something darker, was at play. "Olivia," Sarah whispered softly, her voice full of concern. "You need to tell me what's really going on. I can't help you unless you tell me." Olivia remained silent for a long moment, her small body stiff under the covers. Sarah could see how much Olivia was holding in, how much pain she was trying to hide. It hurt Sarah to see her like this, but she knew they couldn't keep going like this. Something had to change. Olivia finally turned her head, looking up at her mother with wide eyes. "I knew him before," she said, barely above a whisper. The words hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. She didn't know what Olivia meant. "What do you mean, sweetie? How did you know Matthew before?" Olivia hesitated, her eyes darting to the window, avoiding Sarah's gaze. Then, in a voice that shook with fear, she spoke again. "When I was in the orphanage, I saw him there. He followed me. He scared me." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Olivia had spent time in an orphanage before being placed in their care, but Sarah had never heard her speak of any connection to Matthew. It didn't make sense. Matthew had been in the orphanage for years, but they had just met him recently. So how could Olivia have known him before? Sarah pushed her confusion aside and gently urged, "Olivia, honey, you need to tell me more. What exactly did he do?" Olivia's eyes filled with tears, and she curled into herself, trembling. "He would watch me. Everywhere I went, he would just watch me. And at night, he would stand by my bed, just staring at me. It was like he was waiting for something." Sarah felt a chill crawl up her spine as Olivia's voice trembled with the weight of those memories. It wasn't just a child's fear. It was a deep, haunting terror. "And then one day," Olivia continued, "there was this lady. One of the caretakers, she fell down the stairs. She broke her arm, and I think he had something to do with it." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and Sarah couldn't breathe. The pieces were slowly starting to fall into place. Olivia wasn't just scared of Matthew now. She had been scared of him long before they brought him into their home. And whatever happened back at the orphanage was still haunting her. Sarah didn't know what to think. How could she have missed this? How could they have brought Matthew into their home unaware of the past he carried with him? What kind of person had Matthew been at the orphanage, and why hadn't anyone warned them? Sarah's heart ached for Olivia. The little girl she had raised and loved had been carrying this fear for so long, and now it was starting to bleed into their family life. There were too many unanswered questions, and the fear in Olivia's eyes was a constant reminder that they were in over their heads. Something had to be done. Sarah couldn't stand by any longer. The next day, Sarah couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled over her. Olivia's revelation had shaken her to the core, and she couldn't ignore the growing unease she felt every time she looked at Matthew. It wasn't just Olivia's fear anymore. It was something more insidious. Sarah and Mark decided they had to do something. But what? They needed to get to the bottom of what was going on with Matthew, and they had to do it fast. They couldn't let this linger any longer, especially not with Olivia so terrified. That afternoon, Mark made the call to the orphanage. He didn't know exactly what they would find, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that Matthew's past was more complicated than anyone had led them to believe. The orphanage had a lot of records, and it wasn't just a matter of getting background information. It was about uncovering the truth. They needed to know what had happened to Matthew in his past, what had caused him to be placed in so many different foster homes, and whether there were any patterns in the incidents that had followed him from one family to the next. Sarah sat on the couch, waiting anxiously for Mark to return with the information. Her mind raced with all sorts of thoughts. Was Matthew capable of hurting people? Was he somehow causing these strange occurrences in their home? She kept thinking about the broken toys, the doors that opened by themselves, and the way Matthew always seemed to be watching Olivia. There was a cold knot in her stomach, and she couldn't push it away. Every time she tried to reassure herself that it was all just a coincidence, the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong crept back in. Mark finally returned with the information. His face was pale, and Sarah could see the anxiety in his eyes. He handed her a thick folder, and she opened it quickly, eager to see what they had uncovered. As Sarah skimmed through the papers, the truth became clear. Matthew had been through 3 foster families before coming to them. All 3 families had ended their placements with him for reasons that weren't entirely clear, but there were disturbing patterns. In one case, a family's pet had died mysteriously. No one could explain how. In another case, the family's biological child had suffered an accident that left him severely injured. In the third case, there were reports of strange occurrences, flickering lights, objects being moved around, and an overall sense of unease that permeated the household. It was clear that something had followed Matthew from one home to the next. The social workers had never been able to confirm anything suspicious, but the families involved had all reported unsettling events, leading them to return Matthew to the orphanage. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the reports. This wasn't just bad luck. Something dark, something inexplicable, seemed to cling to Matthew, and it was affecting everyone around him. The realization hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She had to face the reality that they couldn't ignore this anymore. Olivia's fear wasn't just about jealousy. It was about survival. Olivia had known something was wrong from the start, and now Sarah had to make the hardest decision of her life. The weight of the decision that lay before Sarah and Mark felt unbearable. They had always believed that family was about unconditional love, about giving someone a chance to heal and grow. But now, everything seemed so uncertain. How could they reconcile their love for Matthew with the terror that their daughter was experiencing? How could they ignore the pattern of strange events that had followed him throughout his life? The more Sarah thought about it, the more torn she became. On one hand, Matthew was just a child, a scared, lost little boy who had been passed from home to home, never truly feeling the security of belonging. But on the other hand, Olivia's safety and well-being had to come first. She couldn't ignore the way Olivia had been acting, the way she was so consumed by fear. Sarah's heart ached for her daughter. She knew what it felt like to be a scared child, unable to explain what you were feeling. She had to protect Olivia, no matter the cost. But Sarah also knew that abandoning Matthew, sending him back to the orphanage, was not the answer. He had already been rejected 3 times before. And if they sent him back, it might be the final blow to his chance at ever finding a real family. After much debate, Mark and Sarah decided to speak with Matthew to try to get to the heart of the issue. They wanted to know what was really going on, whether he was aware of the things that had been happening. Maybe there was something in his past that he hadn't shared, something that could help them understand the strange occurrences around him. Sarah sat down with Matthew in the living room, her heart heavy with the weight of the conversation she was about to have. Matthew sat across from her, his eyes downcast, fidgeting with his hands. He seemed so small, so fragile, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for him. "Matthew," she began gently, "I need to understand what's going on. We've been noticing things. Strange things happening in the house. Things that make Olivia scared. Do you know anything about it?" Matthew looked up at her with a blank expression, his eyes distant. For a moment, Sarah thought he wasn't going to say anything at all. Then, in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, he spoke. "I don't know," he said simply. "I don't mean to scare her. I never wanted to hurt anyone." His words were so innocent, but there was something in the way he said it, something that made Sarah's blood run cold. It was as if Matthew didn't even understand the impact of his presence on those around him, as though the things happening in the house were beyond his control, or worse, something he had learned to live with. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Matthew was hiding something. She didn't know if it was intentional or not, but it felt as though there was a darkness surrounding him, something he couldn't or wouldn't explain. Sarah felt a mix of empathy and fear for Matthew. She could see the hurt in his eyes, the deep-seated pain that had likely followed him from his early years. But she also knew that Olivia couldn't continue to live in fear. She had to protect her daughter. And as much as it broke her heart, Sarah realized that the time had come to make the hardest decision of all. The decision was made, but that didn't make it any easier. Sarah and Mark decided that they needed to take action. Matthew couldn't stay with them, not while Olivia was living in constant fear. As much as it pained them to send him away, it felt like the only option. They couldn't risk Olivia's safety and mental well-being any longer. Sarah sat on the edge of their bed, staring at the empty space where Matthew's things had been. It was hard to believe it had come to this. Just a few weeks ago, their house had been filled with excitement and hope, ready to welcome a new member into the family. But now it felt like a quiet, somber place, a home tainted by fear and uncertainty. Sarah's heart broke for Matthew. He was just a child after all. But he was also a child with a history that was darker than they had ever imagined. No child should have to endure what he had gone through, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder what had happened to him before. What had he witnessed, or worse, what had he done to make him such a focal point of terror in their lives? Mark had already made the arrangements. They had contacted the orphanage to return Matthew, and he would be leaving the next day. As Sarah lay in bed that night, the quiet was deafening. She couldn't stop thinking about Matthew, about the things they didn't know, the things that had led to this. Was he truly dangerous, or was he simply a product of his environment? And if he was truly a victim of his past, how could they have helped him? They had done everything they could, but the reality was that their family's safety had to come first. Sarah turned over, her face buried in her pillow, as tears silently slipped down her cheeks. She wished there had been another way, but she knew deep down that they couldn't continue down the path they were on. Olivia needed to heal, and Sarah needed to protect her. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: their family would never be the same. The next morning, Sarah stood in the doorway as Matthew gathered his things. It was a quiet moment, and no one knew what to say. Matthew didn't look at her or Mark as he packed his small bag. His face was blank, his eyes distant. It was as if he had already accepted his fate. As Sarah watched him leave, a sense of guilt overwhelmed her. Was she doing the right thing? Could she have done more to help him? But she pushed those thoughts aside. They had made the decision, and it was final. As the car pulled away, Sarah stood in the doorway, watching until it was out of sight. It felt like a weight had been lifted, but it also felt like a part of her was gone. Olivia had been through so much already, and now she could finally begin to heal. But Sarah couldn't help but wonder if the decision they made that day would come back to haunt them. If the darkness they had tried to escape from would find a way to follow them, no matter how far they ran. In the days that followed, Sarah and Mark focused on helping Olivia find peace again. The house felt different without Matthew's presence, but it wasn't necessarily better. There was a quietness that hung in the air, almost too still, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. Olivia's fear seemed to fade, but she remained distant, withdrawn, almost as though the trauma she had endured wasn't something that could simply be erased with Matthew's departure. It was clear that the damage had already been done. Olivia didn't want to talk about Matthew. She didn't even want to hear his name. Whenever Sarah tried to bring up the idea of discussing what had happened, Olivia would shut down, her eyes becoming hollow and sad. It was heartbreaking to see her so broken, so distant. Sarah tried to reassure Olivia, telling her that everything was okay now, that the danger had passed. But the emptiness in Olivia's eyes told a different story. The nightmares started to lessen, but Olivia still couldn't sleep through the night without waking up in tears. Sarah would find herself sitting beside Olivia's bed, holding her hand, just to make sure she knew that she wasn't alone. It was the least she could do. They sought counseling to help Olivia work through the trauma she had faced, and slowly, very slowly, Olivia began to open up. But it wasn't easy. Sarah learned that healing wasn't linear. Some days Olivia was able to play with her toys and laugh, but other days, the weight of everything would return, and she would retreat back into herself. Sarah understood now how deep the scars ran, even though Olivia never spoke about them directly. There were moments when Sarah wondered if they had made the right choice. Was sending Matthew away the best thing for him, or had they only made things worse? It was a question that haunted her every night as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. What if they had misunderstood everything? What if Matthew had been just as much a victim as Olivia? But there was no going back now. They had done what they thought was best at the time, and for now that had to be enough. As time passed, their family began to heal. It wasn't a perfect recovery, and there were still moments of tension, of fear, but slowly, they found their way back to each other. Olivia started to smile more, to talk more, and though she would never forget the things that had happened, she started to believe that she could move forward. Sarah knew that Olivia's strength had been tested in ways she would never fully understand, but she was proud of her. The experience had changed all of them. They had been forced to confront a truth about their family that they hadn't been prepared for, but they had made it through. Olivia was beginning to trust again, and Sarah knew that with time, they would all heal, even if the scars would remain. As for Matthew, she didn't know what happened to him after he left. She didn't know if he ever found the family he deserved, or if he was still haunted by the things that had followed him throughout his life. Sarah prayed that he would find peace one day, just as she hoped Olivia would. But for now, she could only focus on the future. Their family was still healing, still moving forward, and that was all that mattered. As the months passed, life began to regain some normalcy. Olivia's nightmares became less frequent, and she started to engage more with her friends, something Sarah hadn't seen in a long time. There was still a quiet sadness in her eyes, but it was different now. It wasn't the all-consuming fear that had once gripped her every waking moment. Olivia was slowly starting to piece herself back together. The therapy sessions had helped, though Sarah couldn't help but feel that there was still a part of Olivia that was unreachable, a part that she hadn't been able to protect. Mark and Sarah worked hard to create a safe and loving environment for Olivia, and they made sure to spend quality time with her, doing the things she loved, like going to the park or baking cookies together. It was their way of showing her that she was safe, that they were there for her no matter what. But every now and then, Sarah would catch Olivia looking out the window, a faraway look in her eyes. And Sarah would feel that pang in her chest again, the nagging feeling that something was still wrong, still unresolved. As much as Sarah wanted to pretend that everything was okay, there were still pieces of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. Olivia had been through something unimaginable, and Sarah knew that the scars from that experience would take a long time to heal. Sometimes Olivia would ask about Matthew. It was always subtle, just a passing mention, but it was enough for Sarah to realize that the memory of him still lingered. "Do you think Matthew is okay?" Olivia had asked one afternoon as they sat together on the couch watching TV. The question hit Sarah hard. She hadn't thought about Matthew in a long time, not directly anyway. She had pushed the memories of him out of her mind, focusing instead on helping Olivia recover. But Olivia's question brought it all back. Sarah hadn't known how to answer. What could she say? "I hope he's okay," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely audible. "I hope he finds the love and support he needs." It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was all she could give. She didn't know what had happened to Matthew after he left, and she wasn't sure if she ever would. All she knew was that sending him away had been one of the hardest decisions of her life, and she could only hope that he too would find a path to healing, just as Olivia had begun to. Sarah tried not to dwell on the past, but it was impossible to forget the impact Matthew had had on their lives. He had left a mark on their family, and although it wasn't a mark they wanted, it was one they couldn't erase. The questions about what could have been, about whether they had made the right choice, lingered in Sarah's mind, but she knew that they had done what they thought was best at the time. All they could do now was move forward, one step at a time, and hope that the future would be kinder to them. The years passed, and though the shadow of that time never fully disappeared, Sarah began to see her family return to a sense of normalcy. Olivia was growing, and every day she seemed more like the joyful child Sarah had known before. There were still moments of quiet, reflective sadness, but they were becoming fewer, and Sarah held on to the hope that her daughter was healing in ways that were less visible. It wasn't a perfect healing. There were still things left unsaid, things Sarah couldn't reach. But Sarah had learned that healing doesn't always happen in big moments. It happens quietly, in the small moments of laughter, in the days that don't end with tears, and in the way Olivia began to trust again. Even though Olivia had moved past the worst of her trauma, Sarah couldn't help but wonder about Matthew. Every now and then Sarah would catch herself thinking about him, wondering where he was, what had happened to him. Had he found a family? Was he still in the system? Or had the darkness that seemed to follow him still plagued him? These questions lingered in Sarah's mind, unanswered. She often thought about the strange things that had happened when Matthew was with them, the broken toys, the unexplained noises, Olivia's fear. She still didn't have answers to those questions, and perhaps she never would. But part of her believed that what had happened wasn't just about Matthew. It was about what their family had gone through together, the decisions they had made, the struggles they had faced, and how they had managed to survive it all. That was the most important thing. Despite everything, despite the pain, despite the fear, they had come out the other side stronger, more united. Sarah still carried the weight of that decision, but she no longer questioned it as much. She had learned that sometimes, even when you don't have all the answers, you have to trust your instincts and do what you think is best in the moment. The truth was, she would never forget Matthew. He had been a part of their family, even if it was only for a short time, and the impact of that time would stay with her forever. But Sarah also knew that they couldn't change what had happened. All they could do was move forward, learning from the past and using that knowledge to create a better, safer future. Olivia was okay now, and that was all that mattered. As Sarah reflected on everything that had happened, she realized how much she had grown throughout the entire experience. There had been a time when she wasn't sure if her family would make it through what they had faced with Matthew. She had felt lost, unsure of the right decisions, and consumed by the fear that she might have ruined everything. But now, years later, she could see the bigger picture. They had made it. Despite the pain, despite the fear, they had survived, and Olivia had become stronger because of it. Sarah knew she would never forget the lessons learned during that time. The lessons about trust, love, and protection. She had learned that sometimes doing what feels right isn't always easy, but it's necessary. And she had also learned that no matter how tough things get, her family would always be there for each other. Olivia had come so far, and Sarah was proud of how far her daughter had come. There was still healing to be done, but they were on the right path, and for Sarah, that was enough. As she watched Olivia walk into the kitchen one evening laughing with her father, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Life had a way of throwing obstacles at them, but in the end, it was the love they shared that had gotten them through it all. And that was something no one, not even Matthew, could take away from them. The past would always be there, but Sarah was ready to let it go and embrace the future with her family by her side.